All right, it's 2 minutes past the hour. This is Chris Fabian from ResourceX. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm joined today by Shane Kavanaugh from GFOA and Eric Keck, longtime city manager, two-time implementer of priority-based budgeting, and now on the ResourceX team. And we're very lucky to have both of them on the call today. This is another webinar in the series that we've been providing over the last few weeks to provide resources and insight and content for the COVID response. Just a little bit of background, we provided a webinar from the perspective of Chloe Ross in the city of Boise a few weeks ago. The response was very positive, and we had heard from a number of our organizations who we currently work with, as well as others who we don't work with, to have something to say about planning for mid-year budget adjustments and overall starting to think through what are types of strategies that we might be able to explore for those of us looking at various scenarios for expense reduction and possibly revenue increase as well. So that was the background for the design of this particular webinar. It's on the heels of a GFOA webinar that Shane and I did just last week with the city of Fort Collins and the city of Branson. That webinar recording is free and available to access on the GFOA website, and the topic was scenario planning. I will do a quick recap in the slides of what that webinar was about. Whereas last week with Shane, we talked about the approach to scenario planning in times of great uncertainty, why it's such a helpful tool. The overall premise is that as we're looking out towards the future, the very near-term future and the future down the road, there is surely this tension that we all feel. The guy on the left-hand side representing the part of all of us that is desperate to make decisions and have actions to take right now, and the tension that we feel is the person on the right trying to constantly recognize that the problem we're trying to solve is not totally clear yet. It's a bit uncertain, it's evolving, and that's why scenario planning can be such a helpful tool. It emphasizes that we should imagine possibilities for how this all could play out and have a playbook of solutions for all of those potential scenarios instead of trying to guess how everything's going to play out and putting all the eggs in that particular basket. So last week in the webinar with Shane and GFOA, we broadly outlined 4 imaginable, plausible scenarios that we thought were important to start thinking about and to start testing your solutions against. In the top left, we have the little v, if you will. The letters that I'll go through are meant to describe the path of your revenue streams. So with little v, the idea was, yes, we're all taking a hit economically right now, but there will be some sort of swift return to recovery. And that's the one that we all hope for, definitely that's the case. And if that plays out, there are more short-term quick fixes that we can apply to bridge the gap and get by until that recovery emerges. That's one plausible scenario. In the top right, there's a bigger V, which simply means it's a little bit more of a hit, a deeper hit than little v. Again, the return to some recovery is rapid, and this is definitely plausible, but the hit economically is more severe than little v. Again, there are some short-term strategies that we can deploy to survive the big V, and we'll get into those in this webinar. In the bottom left, there's something of the double hit, where yes, it looks like we're able to contain the virus for some period of time, but then there's a return to shelter in place, the resurgence of the virus, and our economies take a hit not once but twice, representing a W. And there are different types of strategies to approach the W recovery. And then of course there's the L, which is the fact that there might be a permanent shift, a much larger drop in our revenue streams as we enter potentially a recessionary time. And so we're not trying to say that any of these scenarios are going to play out. We have no more information on that than anybody. But the point was, if we can start to imagine these scenarios, then we can start to test the solutions that you're starting to build for their appropriateness for any of these situations. And so that's the point of today's webinar, is for each of these scenarios, we want to start to explore actions that you could take and strategies that you could deploy, not only for your short-term survival, if there's little v and big V that emerge and play out, but what long-term transformation could look like if we have to make some of the decisions that are programmatic in nature for the W and L scenarios. So as I mentioned, today joining me, we have Eric Keck from a city manager's perspective to weigh in on some of the strategies that we will be outlining. We have Shane Kavanaugh, who will be sharing some of the resources from GFOA's perspective. Shane will be talking specifically about little v and big V scenarios as we get started. And then I will come in to talk about approaches for the W and L scenario. We're going to go ahead and start with little v and big V approaches right before I hand it off to Shane here. So if these emerge, the idea is there are some things that we can do right now to survive, to make adjustments in the budget, and to act very quickly. Some of these solutions are not so terribly complex in nature. They can be deployed more rapidly, and that's really important about some of the solutions that are one-time or quick fix in nature in order to bridge that gap. So the idea is we can survive, we can act fast. The second point of our approach for little v and big V solutions is that they can possibly buy you time in order to survive a little bit longer and watch and see how things are starting to evolve and play out and learn, is there anything more of a W or L emerging? The third point is to allow yourself and your organization to prolong some of the heftier decisions that come along with programmatic changes that we might explore for those W's and L's, and that's key. For most of us, we were hit sort of by surprise, to say the least, with the emergence of this virus and the state shelter-in-place strategies. Let's not be caught off guard for the possibility that a W or L emerges. Now is the time to actually try to build out our plans for W or L if they emerge, and hopefully they won't. But we have not a ton of time, but some time to plan for those. So we're going to dive right in. I'm going to hand over the controls to Shane. Shane, I believe you can click share screen.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Okay.
And we're going to do this. Let's see, that should hopefully work. I'm hoping you see my slides at this point.
Perfect.
Yep,
All right.
we got you.
Fantastic. Good. All right. Well, everybody, number one, thank you for having me here on the webinar today. It's always a pleasure to join the ResourceX community to talk about this stuff, because I know you guys are very interested in kind of good financial management techniques and making wise long-term decisions. So always a fun crowd to speak with. So yeah, as Chris said, kind of be focusing here on the big V and the little v scenarios. And one thing that GFOA released recently was a paper called Cash is King, Short-Term Strategies to Slow the Flow of Money Out the Door. And so these are the sorts of things that would fit very well in the little V scenario. I understand a number of GFOA members have actually used this paper as a kind of checklist where this is just essentially a list of different techniques you might wish to consider. And so they have this list in front of them. They're just going right down it to see which of those would be most applicable in their situation. Though now for kind of going beyond that though, right? These are short-term strategies to slow the flow of money out the door. And maybe that works just fine by itself for the little V, but you know, there's a possibility that we could have a big V, right? As Chris said. So there's more after the Cash is King paper. The Cash is King paper really fits into this 12-step financial recovery process that we have at this website, gfoa.org/FFA for fiscal first aid. And this is also the place where you can get that access to the recording for the scenario planning webinar that Chris mentioned. But the cash is king type of techniques fit into step 3, which we saw on this slide, which is the generic treatments. But the question is, well, if that's not enough, what if we need more? We're in the big V. So we're working on a new resource right now, fiscal first aid techniques. So that is under development as we speak. Hopefully it'll be out in a week or two. And it's sort of like the next level up from cash is king. So if you start with cash is king and you feel or you find that those aren't getting you to where you need to be, fiscal first aid would be the next thing that you would take a look at. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is, rather than go through the techniques that are in Cash is King, because you guys can just certainly read that, I'm going to get into some of the newer information that's not out there yet, that's involved in our fiscal first aid research. And I'm not going to go into a ton, like a laundry list of different things you might do, because I think that might be, maybe not the most exciting presentation. So what I am going to do instead is talk about 2 things that will help you get the most out of any fiscal first aid or cash is king technique that you decide would be a good idea for your organization to provide. And the first of those things is establishing the decision-making environment for fiscal first aid. So the idea being is you can create a decision-making environment that encourages clear thinking and wise choices about fiscal first aid. So obviously you'll be a lot better off if you have that in place. So the first element of this decision-making environment is to establish a culture of frugality. So when you're in a situation of severe financial distress, folks need to understand that every dollar counts, right? And when they understand this, they're going to understand then why fiscal first aid is necessary. And when they understand why, they're going to be more likely to decide to support fiscal first aid or even volunteer their own ideas for balancing the budget. So kind of we have here this idea of the kind of culture of frugality, and a kind of a good starting point for this, of course, is just to announce that frugality is more important than ever before, but you need to back that up with action so that you can show people that this culture change is real. And one of my favorite examples comes from 2008, when we actually originally did a lot of the research behind the GFOA 12-step financial recovery process. During the 2008 recession, the mayor of one small city decided to start mowing the lawn in front of City Hall by himself, so the city could cut back on contracted maintenance costs. So this was obviously a pretty, we'll say, tangible demonstration that the mayor was holding spending in line pretty seriously. Now, I'm not saying that every local government leader should or can start doing the yard work in front of City Hall, but the mayor's actions, again, were very tangible demonstration of support. Now, luckily, there is less dramatic ways local governments and leaders can send a similar message. But what I think the lesson from the mayor's example tells us is that these messages will be a lot more effective if people can see that the leadership is taking the same bitter medicine that they're asking other people to endure. So a couple of examples of that might be desktop printers or other sorts of like personal office equipment that are seen as perks. So those sorts of things might be something that can be cut. Delaying or eliminating replacement of vehicles, where this will lead to increases in maintenance costs beyond available savings. So don't exempt the vehicles used by management staff or elected officials, or putting more limits on travels and expenses. And those are all kind of like pretty common sorts of things. And each of those will have limitations about how they can be applied in the current environment. Like obviously there's not a whole lot of travel happening right now, so it wouldn't be difficult to cut that. But also thinking about, are there programs or other things that can be deferred? And, if those programs are something that were like, maybe particularly of interest to elected officials or top appointed officials, deferring those would send a very powerful message that top leaders are taking this culture of frugality seriously and would inspire other folks to do the same. So moving on here to this next slide is a powerful complement to frugality is valuing results over inputs and outputs. So kind of the idea here is that improving perceptions of, let's say, public safety, for example, would be a result. And you should value that over the number of police officers you have, which would be an input, or the number of police patrols you have, which represents an output. This is because if inputs and outputs are the definition of success, then success is going to become very difficult to achieve, maybe even impossible, because you've got an environment of diminished resources, right? So when you have an environment of diminished resources, it's very difficult to win or realize success if you're defining success by the inputs you have or the outputs you have. If you're using results as a definition for success, on the other hand, though, people can still succeed by finding more creative and cost-effective ways to reach the result. Now, focusing on results can also support a second important component of this decision-making environment we're talking about, and that's be willing to spend money to save money. So earlier I had the little Scrooge cartoon. So the idea is really you don't want that mindset, because overly simplistic frugality could lead to penny-wise, pound-foolish decision-making. Sometimes it's necessary to spend money to spur cost savings innovations. Like example could be labor saving technology, bring in outside technical expertise, or maybe using a consultant to help validate your financial position and create the kind of urgency to act with people in your organization. So you kind of want to take, I guess, the best of the Scrooge spirit, but also realize that you have to spend money to save money, and really focus on value and not just cutting costs. All right, moving on to the kind of next element of the decision-making environment, and that's framing the crisis. So a lot of times financial downturns or financial distress results in a frame that is known as the siege or a bunker mentality. And this is a destructive mentality because it promotes conformity, because people hunker down in an attempt to preserve the status quo, right? You feel the organization is under attack, and people then just try to preserve what they have, and that's it. Now, the problem is that this stifles innovation, and this is the innovation that's going to be needed to successfully navigate the recovery process. So a different frame that you want to think about is seeing the opportunity in the crisis. So a crisis is going to produce a lot of game-changing sorts of events that can be used to break free of constraining past practices and habits. And so some examples of particular maybe game-changing events in a financial crisis might be big revenue losses, bond rating downgrades. These will get people's attention and maybe help create a sense of urgency to do things a little different. COVID pandemic, of course, has a whole new set of game-changing events, including maybe new emergency management procedures that you need to develop, and maybe the opportunity for government to provide a real kind of sense of leadership to their communities. So a lot of opportunities that maybe are not going to be obvious to people, but to the extent that you as leaders in your organization can frame the crisis that way, there'll be a lot more ability and willingness of people to act. Now, kind of a question though here is you're framing the perception of others, right? So how you frame it is crucial. And oftentimes, a lot of the information you're sharing is going to be bad news, right? So you're going to have bad news you're going to need to share. It's not pleasant. A lot of maybe potential there to have your credibility harmed, or people kind of view you in a negative light as you're delivering this bad news. Now, the good news is though, that our research has suggested a simple 3-part rule for how to share bad news while still maintaining the trust of your audience and optimizing their ability to act on the information that you're sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and share that rules with you. Is number 1, be prompt. So 2 reasons for this is, number 1, by being prompt, you maximize the time that decision makers have to act on the information you're providing. And number 2 is that research shows that people are undiscerning listeners. We tend to believe what we hear. And why this is important is that that means it's a lot easier to preempt misinformation than it is to correct misinformation when it's already out there. Because the misinformation, if they're exposed to it first, they're going to tend to believe it. And then it gets stuck in their head and it's more difficult to dislodge. So it's better to be first and get the right information out there first, and then misinformation has to then dislodge the correct information. So to the extent you can be first, you will be ahead of the game when it comes to combating misinformation. Number 2 is be straight. So in our research, the finance officers we were interviewing with counseled against taking a doom and gloom sort of approach or sugarcoating the problem, and instead just giving it to people straight. The idea being, if folks find out later that the problem was either under or oversold, they may feel manipulated, and that is, of course, going to hurt the credibility of the person that delivered the message. And then lastly is to provide solutions. So the term that the finance officers we interviewed for this project used was to not drop problems in people's lap. And the idea being there is coming prepared with some solutions will give people a sense of control over the situation. Now, that said, you don't want to provide too many options because you can get to a thing or encounter a thing called analysis paralysis. And the idea being is the kind of more options people have, the actually less likely they are to make a decision. So a good number of options is around 3 or so. You don't want to provide too few options. So for example, if you provide only one possible course of action, people may not feel a real sense of ownership because they're being given a take it or leave it sort of choice. So if you think about it, they've got one option, their only kind of alternative to that option is just reject it entirely, which is not a good situation. So having a small number of options is a good way to avoid decision-making paralysis, but also give a chance for people to take some ownership of the decision by giving input into the direction. Okay, the next part here is long-term planning and forecasting. So the idea here is that your decision-making environment has to ensure that the steps taken to achieve a balanced budget in the short term are consistent with the goals of building a long-term strong financial foundation for your community. Now, a lot of short-term budget balancing techniques have long-term consequences, as I'm sure you guys know. And if you guys over rely on these types of solutions, we could find that we're enduring kind of a low grade but persistent financial distress after this immediate crisis has passed. So we clearly don't want that. So having long-term planning and forecasting as part of your recovery effort will make sure your fiscal first aid attempts don't cripple your organization in the long term. And I think a lot of things that Chris is advocating here in terms of the ResourceX model accomplish that. So kind of making this part of your recovery strategy and your fiscal first aid planning process is an excellent way to go. Okay, moving on to the next part here I want to share with you guys is a 2-part management system for using fiscal first aid. So if the decision-making environment helped us make wise choices, the management system is going to then help us get the most out of those choices once we make them. So getting the most bang for our buck. And there are really 2 parts to this management system I'm going to share with you. The first part is securing financial position. So those retrenchment tactics that I mentioned in the Cash is King paper will help you stabilize financial position in the short term. But the management techniques I'm going to share with you in the next few slides will help provide a more consistently stable financial position. And the second part of this 2-part management system is to be data-driven and results-oriented. So this complements that advice we gave earlier to emphasize results in the decision-making environment. The management system then brings this ideal into reality. So let's get into each of these. So first, we'll start with cash flow monitoring. The little 1 I have there refers to the fact we're talking about number 1, secure financial position. So the idea behind cash flow monitoring is to show the flow of cash in and out, your cash balances, and other important events that could impact cash position, like maybe important expenditures or revenues that predictably occur during certain points of the year. And so the idea here is you're going to pinpoint when fiscal first aid will need to be applied. So just looking at this chart, the little dashed red line is your outflows, the little black solid line is your inflows, and then the filled area is your balance. And so the gray part above 0 is good, and the red part below 0 is bad. So as you're going through your year, I think this would help make it more obvious where fiscal first aid techniques might need to be applied. So if you can see kind of in the middle of your screen, if you read closely, that says April 2021. And where you saw a little downturn here that leads to a fairly sizable red dip. You see that coming up, well, this is a point where maybe we better start looking harder at some of those cash is king and fiscal first aid techniques, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves with a negative balance. So this kind of modeling helps you nail the timing of fiscal first aid techniques and when they need to be applied. Moving on is the control system. So the control system really kind of builds upon cash flow resources or cash flow forecasting, because the cash flow forecast provides information on the flow, and the control system turns this information into action for maintaining stability. So you think about reviewing your control system and look for weaknesses. Budgetary variance is a great starting point. I know Chris has a lot of good examples that he probably shared with you on some other webinars, and can likely share some on this webinar, I'm sure, about how to compare budgets to past spending and finding out where maybe budgets are consistently underspent and looking for opportunities there, and other sorts of insights that can come from variance analysis. I think position control is an obvious one of why that's important. You want to keep headcount in parameters. And finally, capital project control. So asking questions like, are schedules adhered to and are estimates accurate? For projects you have planned, are the operating and maintenance impacts of those projects known and accounted for in your financial plans? So these are all sorts of the very important questions to think about with your capital projects and controlling those costs. We've got sources of liquidity. So reserves, I think, are probably the most obvious source of liquidity. And the kind of think what we can add there is to say, know your risks. So a big question right now, like they say before this whole situation happened, the kind of the $1 million question people were asking was how much reserves is enough? How much should we have? So the new $1 million question is how much can we use? And to answer that, you have to know your risks. So in other words, if your reserves are meant to protect you against economic downturns as well as a series of natural disasters, what are those natural disasters and how much money would you reasonably need to have set aside to deal with them? So knowing the answer to that question tells you how much you have available or can reasonably use for this crisis. Internal borrowing is another strategy. We just released an article on that in the GFOA magazine in December called, I think it was your last line of financial defense, and about using internal borrowing as a liquidity strategy. So you can access that article if you think that's something you need to consider. And then lastly, internal service funds and cost allocation plans. I know this is an area of expertise for Chris, so he can share more information with you about on that one. All right, we're going to move on to kind of this next part, which is the making managers manage. And this is a strategy that's a very good place to start when you're thinking about your management system. And I'll just tell like a little story here that really illustrates it. So in one big Midwestern city, Minneapolis, in fact, that's a picture of Minneapolis, they had a situation where departments were consistently overspending their budget. So the finance director's first move was to put budget analysts in each department to try and cajole the departments into following their budget. Unsurprisingly, that didn't work. So the finance director took the analysts out and told the department directors, you know what, no more analysts, but you guys are now in charge of your own budgets. But the thing is, if you're over your budget, you have to go before our Ways and Means Committee at our monthly meeting and explain why you're over budget, and then come back for the next 2 months to update them on how you're doing with your budget management. And maybe unsurprisingly there, the budget compliance improved dramatically virtually overnight, right? So that is kind of the idea of being here. The takeaway is that sometimes you have these layers of control that have been developed that are of questionable effectiveness. So think about how you can put the onus on managers to do the right thing and avoid the overhead of these controls. Because as you can imagine, the new approach, the make managers manage approach, was a lot more cost effective than the having budget analysts in every department approach. Next part here is provide accurate, timely, and understandable information about spending. So this is just a little example of a dashboard from the city of Tempe, Arizona. And really pretty simple. The idea being is you've got an annual budget, break it down into monthly or quarterly guidelines to let you know if you're on track to meet the budget. So you'll need that kind of short-term perspective. I won't dwell a lot of that on that because I think it's fairly straightforward, but an essential part of putting together a system to get the most out of your fiscal first aid. And then what really this all brings us to is the idea of what an ideal monitoring system looks like. So I'm going to share through just a little experiment that I think illustrates it. So in this experiment, you had a room full of people, and those folks in the room were being asked to take a test, and there was a reward for doing well on the test. But kind of the trick was that the experimenters had set it up so that folks could find ways to cheat on the test. And what they wanted to know is if the conditions in the room influenced how much people cheated. So they turned down the lights, and it turns out more people cheated when the lights were down. They had the lights back up and painted cartoon eyes on the wall, and it turns out that less people cheated when the lights were up and cartoon eyes were on the wall. And why is this, you might ask? Well, it's because when you turn the lights down, people felt like they couldn't be seen as easily. And when you turn the lights up and had the cartoon eyes on the wall, people felt their actions were transparent and they were being watched, right? So less likely to cheat. And so what this tells us for fiscal first aid is developing a system whereby actions are transparent and people's reputations are on the line will be very powerful. I think we can see that in that Minneapolis example where their actions were transparent. We knew whether they were exceeding their budget or not, and their reputations were on the line because they were going to, before the Ways and Means Committee, to report on how they were doing. And this slide here with the dashboard is another way to help make people's actions transparent and provide information about what's happening. So now the flip side to that, or the other side of the coin, is that, sometimes despite their best efforts, some managers are simply going to be unlucky and are not going to be able to stick to the spending plan. Things may not go their way. And if they are essentially punished for bad luck, their natural response is going to be to add padding to their budget, which is going to make your job harder when it comes to balancing. So you have to have their back and help them manage unexpected and unavoidable spending. So just a little story about that here is this one comes from San Bernardino County, California, where they were trying to develop a central contingency. So in other words, pull the padding out of the department budgets, have a central contingency that all departments drew upon for risk. And the sheriff went along with it. The county CEO said, don't worry, you kind of give us this money and we'll help you out when the time comes. And the time came where there was a rogue LA police officer that was on the loose in San Bernardino County, and they had to have a big giant manhunt for him. And the sheriff calls the CEO and says, I'm spending money like crazy. What do I do? And the CEO said, don't worry, we've got your back. You take care of what you need to do from a public safety perspective. We'll figure out the money part. And what was powerful about that is not only was the sheriff convinced, all the other departments who were watching this were also convinced, and all of them then felt a lot more comfortable about giving up that padding in favor of this central contingency. So kind of just real last stuff here. These things that you guys and the community here for ResourceX definitely get is formulating your budget in a way that's result-oriented and data-driven, inventorying your programs and key indicators of financial condition benchmarking data. So you guys are, I think, well ahead of the curve when it comes to these things. So integrating them into your approach to managing your financial distress will be a great opportunity. And then just kind of lastly, I think where this is all going is using the cash is king and fiscal first aid techniques as a sort of checklist. So we just have some examples here of what that might look like, and then using the strategies that we just went through in terms of decision-making environment and management system to get the most out of these choices. So with that, I am completed, and I am going to hand it over back to Chris.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks so much. I've resumed sharing the screen, and just like Shane was walking through, I really appreciate, Shane, your bigger picture perspective on how to approach these types of solutions. And also, as you're starting to see little V or big V emerge, it's not enough just to have your solutions for the equation, how to work in internal borrowing or how to look at internal service funds, but also to make sure that you have leadership from the top, leading by example. Just really, really powerful message, Shane. Thank you so much for being here. Everybody on the screen, what we've done is begun to mine some of the cash is king suggestions and strategies, and you see them both for a little V-shaped recovery and a deeper V. And we hope that this is a resource for you as you're starting to kind of add up and inventory all the possible ways that you can react to both of these short-term recovery scenarios. We would hope that you can begin to think what's right for you. If you're eliminating variances, taking a look at vacancies, that you're literally creating a scoreboard for the types of solutions that are appropriate. I wanted to turn it over to Eric Keck, just as you think, Eric, about some of the short-term bridge the gap strategies that you see here. Just from the city manager's perspective, what's on your mind as you would be reviewing your series of options?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Shane. As a former city manager, I wish I would have had these checklists back in 2008, 2009, as they would have provided an excellent blueprint to follow or playbook to follow. One of the things I'll say is this, and Shane hit the nail on the head, and that is you need to establish that decision-making environment first and foremost where leadership is going to be required. Right now, deep leadership's required to make decisions. This checklist really, though, is super helpful for this type of recovery that's anticipated. And certainly every organization is going to approach this differently. But this playbook that's being shown on the screen right now is an outstanding way and place to start. Yeah, we'll make sure that we get this checklist available to you. It's in the slides that Chris posted the link to, so you should be able to download these slides. But what will end up happening for your organization from a managerial perspective is this. If you haven't had the opportunity or taken the time prior to a disaster to look at this, then the thing that you're going to want to be most concerned with up front is not getting into a stress response. And people's stress response normally when a crisis occurs is, I'm just going to make the decision myself, or I'm going to be top down and dictate and demand that certain things happen. So you need to have your head about you first and foremost to engage all of your stakeholders, all your departments to help you go through these checklists and work together to create the solution that's going to work for your organization. Because one of the things that Shane brought up was under control systems, looking at capital project controls. And, it may be that a capital project is super important. And we all know that all of our communities and organizations have capital projects and infrastructure that's critical, that if we put it off and it's delayed because it has a general funding component, it may never happen, or it'll be more difficult to happen in the future. So you need, again, to work as a team and engage all your stakeholders in determining the best course of action for your organization and what will work for you. Because again, every organization culture is different, and it's important to have that leadership have a pulse on that, number one. Number two, engage folks in ensuring that they're part of the solution. And a lot of times, again, like I said, in a crisis environment, that doesn't happen. So again, if you can't plan ahead of time for a worst case scenario, like one of our clients that we have right now, Washington County, Wisconsin, created a fiscal endurance exercise planning for this very moment. And so they're poised to be able to be very successful or more successful in this environment to see a sustainable future. But again, going through this checklist and figuring out, hey, where can we make subtle adjustments, as Chris said in the outset, to buy yourself time to create the space to really talk about the more difficult scenario planning is going to be key. So take the time to do that as well as to not only make the subtle adjustments now, but begin that long-term planning for what happens if we have the W or the L, and frame it in such a way that you're bringing your voices into the table to all participate in some long-term planning and forecasting that will help you to be successful if the worst case scenarios happen. So that's what I would say right now. I'll have more to say, I think, when we get to the W and the L, again, because a lot of times elected officials, the one thing that I'll say too, whether it's crisis or not, they really do not like mid-year budget adjustments. So as I used to say, we need to measure twice and cuss once, because if you get it wrong and have to go back again, it's going to be frowned upon, not only by your elected officials, but by your citizenry, thinking, oh man, what are they doing? All the football, all the money, see what's happening. So again, avoid that situation where you have to go back to the well more than once. Chris?
Thanks a lot, Eric. And just as Eric mentioned, the idea here, our approach for you to consider is to deploy these types of strategies, just like Eric said, to buy yourself the time to get through the immediate situation and start to plan for the W or the L that might emerge. Shane mentioned some of the approaches to cash flow measurement and monitoring, and this is exactly what we've been working on with organizations who are joining on the free fiscal health approach, that if there is a little V, we start to deploy strategies like in this scenario, like a mid-year budget adjustment, and maybe that does help us look out towards the future and say, hey, we're going to make it through this. This looks good. But then to begin to model what happens if there is a deeper V, and then we have to look towards maybe a second mid-year budget adjustment is what you don't want to have to do, as Eric Heck just mentioned, but constantly measuring your inventory of solutions against the emerging environment. And then, here we start to see more of an L emerging in our forecast. If this is the case, then we're simply emphasizing stress testing the W or the L environment, adding up all your short-term solutions. If they're not enough, that's when we have to graduate towards something more substantial. For those of you who have been doing priority-based budgeting, you have programmatic data, and in this next section, we're going to talk about how to apply that programmatic data. For those of you who don't have program data thus far, we're going to go through a crash course in terms of how to build that. So here we have kind of our entire range of scenarios, and our thesis goes something like this. Right now, everybody on this call, presumably, has at least line item resource data. There's business intelligence in your line item data. What we've done over the creation of priority-based budgeting and program-based budgeting is build more business intelligence by layering a program inventory, building basic costing approaches into the process. You have a program inventory and cost, layering on basic program attributes, and as Shane mentioned, a focus on results. So ascertaining how do the programs impact results, and then some notion of the program's future. And our belief is that as you continue to layer on data, you will build a level of business intelligence that is insightful for tackling the W or the L. Now, presumably, as I talked with Shane about, there might come a point of limiting returns. So you should ask yourself, in the time that you have, you might not have a ton of time to get through building for W or L, but at least get through, for example, a program inventory and program costing, where maybe it sure would be nice to talk about influence of programs on results, but you might not have enough time to be able to do that. If you have something on the order of 1 to 60 days before you're feeling like you need to take action, you're going to be using that time immediately to be applying your line item business intelligence, which is great for decisions that impact, broadly. We're going to defer capital, or we're going to suspend travel, like Shane had mentioned, or we're going to take a look at freezing pay for personnel. It's especially useful for non-personnel cost decisions, like reducing fuel and supplies in this example overall. But the harder part is that if we exhaust our range of solutions at a line item level, we need to be able to look at programmatic decision making, such as what programs are going to need more resources in this next unfolding scenario. What programs can we simply do less of? What programs might we be able to temporarily suspend? Where can we partner? Programmatic decision making is what we're advocating. If you have more than 60 days to plan for, to be able to take action for a W or an L, which we believe that's not a ton of time, but within 60 days, we have City of Scottsdale as an example, who is considering an 8-week plan to be able to put together their business intelligence, to be able to use it as they look out towards the possibility of some of these larger solutions coming into play. So I'm going to talk about the W and the L scenarios. The whole point here, as we've talked about, is that these are for rapid cost adjustments, that's for sure, but also for long-term transformation. We're going to try to focus on how to drive choices about service level offerings, planning for the worst. If we can take the time to plan for W and L right now, then hopefully they don't emerge, but you will have a playbook of possible strategies to consider. If these do play out, we will likely be in a position where we have to make such difficult choices. It will be about how do we prioritize the programs that we can keep, and also maximizing partnerships and leveraging to the greatest extent possible to count on others to help us provide regional collaborative services overall. So a word on the importance of programmatic data, especially for those who don't have programmatic data thus far. I know St. Albert's on the call. This is right out of their book. This is our typical line item budget. And as we start to think about some of the impacts to our core revenue streams that might emerge, this is not This is fictitious, by the way, but if we start to do some scenario planning and see from a sales tax perspective and other revenue streams, things are looking like they're going in the downward trajectory. The trouble is, if we could only depend on these line items for our choices, it's limiting. We can only talk about, well, are we going to cut our transfers? Are we going to look at salaries, wages, and benefits? So we need to be able to get programmatic data to be able to discuss the changes that we might make at a service level. So here's our crash course. We're going to talk about building a program inventory. This is our crash course in creating programmatic data. A program inventory is quite simple. It is a list of everything that you do. Every department provides programs, presumably, for where they use their resources. In St. Albert, they had 152 programs. This is something that everybody can do, is have their departments inventory the programs that you provide. This is what PBB communities have, and a description of those programs. Going one layer up is trying to allocate our line item data to the program inventory, and that's through program costing. So that is literally taking each department's budget as they know it and trying to understand from a personnel perspective, from a non-personnel perspective, and also key from a revenue recovery perspective for those programs that do have fees and charges coming into play. How do those resources align with programs? So here I've drilled into each department across the budget, and within each department are the types of programs that they offer. So for example, in solid waste management, we have everything from curbside garbage collection to our recycling program to public education. It's going to be really key to understanding where your resources are currently going so that you can start to have a conversation about if you're adjusting for W or L, what services are you going to try to make decisions on? We're going to try to drive decisions at a programmatic level. So if you have the time to do a cost allocation to those programs, allocating personnel and non-personnel and even revenue, that would be phenomenal. And then all the way through program prioritization, as Shane was mentioning, a focus on results, you might want to know, how do these programs overall impact your economy? We had some discussions just yesterday about if we had to make choices about programs that we're providing, and if we're going to pull back on anything, already realizing certain programs have an impact on the economy, we might want to make sure that those programs are being preserved to the greatest extent possible. So having some basic idea of how programs score is going to be really important. In this crash course, what we typically do, prior to COVID, as we worked with our communities, we would take on what we call the blueprint for action, which has always been focused on, if we have this basic data set, we want to focus on where can we free up resources and where can we generate new revenue in order to fund the future programs that we wish to launch and get into. That is still applicable, but right now our view of the future might be changing, but the blueprint is still an appropriate framework to consider tagging programs or commenting on programs or adding insights, considering what you need resources to actually do. In St. Albert's case, imagine taking their line item budget and being able, by virtue of tagging programs appropriate for each of those resource reallocation opportunity or revenue generating opportunities, this is how they've been able to see their budget and see all of the options that they have for taking action overall. Our contention right now, and this is appropriate for current PBB implementers like St. Albert, as well as those who have not gone through this work, is that this same exercise is legitimate whether we're looking 3 to 5 years down the road or 3 to 5 months down the road. The question is, what lenses would you apply for the insight that you're looking to generate for each of the particular programs overall? And so what we wanted to offer is we've been brainstorming on additional questions to begin to ask for every single program that you offer. Can we tag every program you provide? There will be some that you have to increase, and it's really important that you know that. COVID response is a great example. We've heard from some where their 911 call centers are actually being flooded with incoming calls with people who need information about their healthcare provider. There are going to be certain programs that actually go up, and it's really important to be able to tag those. There will be other programs where it's really important to know you want to keep them on a trajectory of status quo. Think water treatment, where it's not that they need to grow, but there's very little room for compromise. So being able to tag programs that meet that criteria. Service level decrease, even if temporarily, we need to continue to provide this program, but maybe we can be flexible with the level of service. Think about accounts payable, accounts receivable, those types of programs where it's pretty unrealistic that we can discontinue them altogether, but you might want to be able to do them at a bare minimum level of service and either reallocate resources away from that program or temporarily bring that service level down. There will be some where suspending them entirely, even if temporarily, is appropriate, and you want to know which programs can meet that criteria. Think about passport processing, or maybe a water park, overall aquatic center in Parks and Recreation. If you have to make these types of mega decisions, it would be important to be able to identify those programs that fit into this bucket. We have internal partnerships and collaboration, where it's appropriate to consider centralization or consolidation internally. Think different departments who are potentially providing, they have their own fleet garage, or think inspections across your organization, or think IT support. Where can you create those partnerships internally? And then finally, we have regional partnerships overall, where that might be appropriate to do. These are heavy choices that would definitely have an impact on services that you provide, but this is where we're beginning our thinking. We wanted to set up our checklist for W to consider those service level temporary decreases, every one of those options that I just went through. And as we think of anything beyond the W, what has occurred to us is that there potentially could come a time where you've exhausted your V and big V solutions, you've looked at programs, and you have a pretty good idea of where you would suspend certain programs or where you can find some program efficiency or internal partnerships overall. As we think about L, organizations facing L, we've borrowed some of the thinking from New City Operating System and New Localism, where just within the last 2 years, they've been espousing the merits and the power of regional solutions and leveraging regional resources. Our fear is that there could come a time when the reductions are so steep that we really have to think about reframing the situation, as Shane mentioned, where it's unlikely we can provide all of the programs that we currently provide on our own unless we are able to leverage regional partners, public sector, nonprofit, or private sector. Perhaps there will be some that you can continue to provide solo on your own that are of the highest priority, and there will be others for which potentially there's so little resources left over. We face choices like maybe don't provide the program at all, provide some services at such a low level that maybe it's not acceptable, but it's doable, or C, provide it with neighbors and try to figure out how we can provide a regional service for less. Next week, we are going to have a specific focus on planning for the L and the tactic of program mapping. But the idea is super simple, and anybody can do it right now. It is, once you have that inventory of programs, literally convening your neighbors to talk about what programs they offer and starting to imagine where you can create regional win-win partnerships. Eric Keck did this in the city of Inglewood, where their garage became the central garage for Sheridan, Cherry Hills Village, and the Inglewood School District. That type of solution could exist for you today as you start to think about where do you have opportunities to bring in others, and maybe you are that central garage, or you look elsewhere. But we think that this is a completely viable strategy. In Inglewood, they turned right around and reconsidered how they provide fire and merged with the city and county of Denver. This type of regional partnership, again, it's available to us, and this might be something that we all have to consider if we simply had so little resources that we weren't able to uphold every service on our own. So the concept, I know Mike is on the call from Castle Pines, but the idea is for any program you can imagine, who else is actually providing it? We have a platform where we can start to have people load and log the programs that they're offering. Here in this case, in the state of Colorado, Castle Pines and Littleton both providing for sales tax collection. Maybe there's a partnership that could exist right there. We have the city of Fort Saskatchewan who's talked about treasury management and maybe looking to the city of Edmonton, looking for program mapping opportunities. So many great examples, but the idea is, and this is what we'll cover in great detail next week, step one, identify what you offer and be able to understand what your neighbors are providing, and that's what program mapping is all about. Step two, moving into how do you identify those that are the best options, like potentially consolidating fleet, even if it's a temporary solution and not forever. And step three, actually executing them. Eric Keck mentioned Washington County, Wisconsin. They had launched a Counties Without Borders initiative that successfully followed this path and merged health departments with neighboring communities. Englewood, Colorado, as we mentioned in this webinar, Clear Creek County, assembling nonprofits and local service providers, found that there was overlap for 79% of the programs they provided. We're simply emphasizing you want to know what these options are with your neighbors if you have to go that road. So the idea for the L is regional partnerships. We have the time potentially to start to assemble your partners and look for those opportunities. And that's what we, again, will be focusing on this in extensive detail, but I think you get the point right now. If you have between now and say the end of the year to consider these types of partnership opportunities, now is the time to actually get that planning conducted overall. So I know we're pretty much at the end of the hour. I did want to open it up to Eric and then Shane, maybe just for a couple minutes if people have time to stick around, but concluding thoughts. Eric, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. These are obviously very difficult times. And I think for those organizations that already have programmatic-based business intelligence, you're in great shape. There's no need to panic. And it was going to take some leadership on your organization's part to spend the time in that data, looking at the programs, as Chris just outlined, to ensure that there isn't that stress-induced panic response of cutting 10% across the board. We know those blanket cuts don't help organizations, because how do you cut 10% of a public safety program and expect it to be effective and efficient? How do you cut programs that are going to help with the equity of service for your citizenry and your communities? So the best way to do that, again, is to use that programmatic-based business intelligence that you've got. If you don't have that intelligence, like Chris said, there are ways to create it, and we're here to help. Whether you engage us in the long term or just the short term, just to get help to get started. That's why we're here. We want to help you with that. And again, let's not forget the necessity. If you're approaching an L or a W type of scenario where you have to make extreme cuts, as Shane said, deliver the news quickly. Be straight with your folks, because again, they are going to be the ones during this crisis that are going to help you to innovate. And they may have ideas that will eliminate the need for elimination of programs or elimination of services, because they've come up with some thoughts and ideas. Again, bring folks to the table that are within your organization and engage them to help you through this time, because they're going to have thoughts and ideas, rather than, again, getting panicked and stressed and starting to make decisions from the top down that may or may not be beneficial for your organization. Thanks for attending, everybody.
Thanks, Eric. Shane, I wanted to give you the final word if you had some thoughts to share as well, and appreciate everybody if you have to jump off at the end of the hour here, but if those of you are sticking around, we're certainly happy to do that as well.
Sure, I'll keep it very brief because people may have questions that they want to get out there. I think, just closing thoughts is, I agree with everything Eric said. If folks that are on this webinar are doing priority, I should say program inventory, priority budgeting, you're in awfully good shape. No need to panic. If you're not doing those things, also no need to panic, because I think, as Eric said, these are achievable goals. So these are things that you can start to get these resources in place now. And I liked your slide, Chris, quite a bit with the line item in business intelligence. So the point being, even if you've still a line item budget, you've got something to work with. So use the tools you have and start using the kind of research that has been presented on this slide to start getting your plan in place. It definitely can be done.
Thanks so much, Shane. This is that slide. I was just pulling it back up. Quite a few still on the line, which is great. If you did want to take your, well, we have too many people probably to take yourself off mute, but if you wanted to use the chat box, we would be happy to field some questions and stick around for a little while. If you don't know how that works, there's a chat box functionality where you can type your questions in and we can read them. And I know one of them has been, where can we access the slides? And I just posted those, but I can do that again here. That's great. And the checklist, I've also listed the link for Shane's website at GFOA, the Fiscal First Aid Center, and where they're starting to post the majority of their resources, including our walkthrough last week of the scenario planning, but including many more resources besides that. But if you were looking for that webinar, it is here on the GFOA website. Please don't be shy to type in a question if you have anything that you wanted to ask as a follow-up. Or feel free to reach out to any of us as well. I probably should have had contact information, but I'm going to type in Shane's email address here, and you know where to find us, but I'll just type that in anyway.
Oh, I have a question, maybe, if you don't mind, Chris. I'd be interested to know this. We were talking about at the end, you know, if you've got the program inventory and all that stuff, you're in very good shape. If you don't, it's achievable. Where do you guys typically advise people, or would you advise people to like get started? So if you're at the phase like, hey, I don't really have a lot of these things, like what would be your like next steps to making it happen?
Yeah,
like
I mean, that's
boil
great.
It down.
The concept of a program inventory is fundamental to any of the choices that we might want to make about what programs need more resources, what programs can we do less of, and so on. There are great examples out there for organizations to look at, and clearly we help with that if that's something that people wanted to engage us with. But beyond that, there are great examples to go online and see where people have listed their program inventory. It is fairly simple to be able to ask a department, you know, what can we start with the 10 to 20 programs that you offer? What happens in your department? How do you use your resources overall? We believe strongly that the program inventory base layer is the most important thing. If we were to graduate from that base layer, moving beyond a program inventory, the kind of questions that we were getting at, what programs do we need to get on the list to do more of? Which programs can we do less of? Which programs can we partner on? Asking those questions probably is more important than even getting to the cost data, although cost data would probably be important as a next step. But we have listed, I'm going to go back to this slide, a host of questions that we would want to know the answer to for every program that a department identifies. If we could quickly move to, what do we know about it? Can we categorize it? Does it fit into any of these program insight categories overall, where we know it's a program that, hey, we're going to have to grow it. So that's going to be kind of important. Like how how much does it cost us right now, then might be a next question. How much are we really talking about if we have to grow the 911 call center? If it's in status quo, like our water treatment example, maybe we don't have a whole lot of conversation on that. But as we start to move towards others that might be ripe for a partnership, might be at least an idea for internal partnership or consolidation, and especially those where we could do less of it or suspend, even if it's temporary, this concept of tagging programs, it's something we can do in the tools, but outside of the tools, Shane, it's as simple as having this conversation. I bring to you my list of programs, and I've tagged them with one or more of these insight buckets, if you will, and that's what's going to drive our conversation. We want to always know what our options are. After that, knowing about resource allocation is probably going to be the next question. So if you're saying your program needs to grow, what are we really talking about? And then we're back to modeling fiscal health. Can we afford that? And where are those resources going to come from? For those of you who are in the tools, this is the reason that we presented this today, is to say that this is the functionality where we can tag programs with this marker. What type of opportunity are we looking at? This is something that we'd advise everybody to do as an exercise to focus, instead of how we've been doing it for the last 3 to 5 years. What do the next 3 to 5 months look like?
Great. Well, thank you.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We'll stick around for just a little while longer and then wrap it up. We're going to post the recording on our website. If you have other staff members who wanted to see this, hopefully everybody's had a chance to access the slides. Many of you are participating in the Fiscal Health Initiative, where every Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, we are onboarding organizations for 3 months free to be able to take a look at their fiscal health models. And then, as I mentioned, next Friday, we will have Eric Keck really going into detail on program mapping, that being the initiative where we have a little bit more runway to plan. How can we successfully do that? And then how do you execute a partnership overall? If you wanted to consolidate fleet services, what are the legal ramifications, the staffing ramifications that you might want to take into consideration? Eric Heck has done that successfully. So we look forward to presenting that. A good question. Do you recommend going through and tagging all programs and then look where it's prioritized, or do you start with quartile 4 programs and dig into those? Great question, Danielle, and I agree with Eric Keck's response. Probably most successful is to start with all programs on this list, to be able to say where might programs, even in quartile 1, you might find programs that are of the highest priority that lend themselves really well to a regional partnership or an internal partnership, an opportunity to consolidate. Just as we've mentioned, as we've learned here from the city of St. Albert, as they went through the longer term version of Blueprint Insights, is what we call it. There are programs in quartile 1 that lend themselves to a program efficiency discussion, just as there are programs in quartile 4 that someone might identify as, they might think that, yeah, it's a low priority, but we probably still need to do it, even if it's at status quo, our option to suspend temporarily. Being able to see all programs on that list would be super helpful, Danielle. If you only had a little bit of time, it makes sense, your line of thinking, to work your way up. That could be interesting, but as Eric Keck just mentioned, opportunities are going to arise in all the quartiles. Quartiles are a nice second set of eyes, or a comparison data set, some context to double check if someone's recommending service level increase in a quartile 4 program. You might simply want to know, how come? Why is that emerging on your list? But all programs are available there. Thanks for the question. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I'm going to stop sharing now and stop the recording. Again, we will